Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our presentation today. We will be starting here in another minute or so. I'd like to start off with some quick admin notes about the Veterans in Business Network, or the VIB as we're also known. If this is your first time joining us for one of our training series, webinars, etc., welcome. Please join our free VIB Network directory. We do have a list, a directory that we keep for veteran businesses. A lot of corporations, government agencies, when they're looking for veteran-owned businesses, they come to us, and the first place we go to search is in our directory. So please, it's free, doesn't cost anything, gets your name in there, and if there's an opportunity, maybe we can help get you connected with it. Also, we do have an opportunity board that gets updated weekly with various contract opportunities, events, programs, etc. So another good resource. Sign up for our newsletter. I assume most of you heard about this webinar through our newsletter, but in case you didn't, please make sure you're signed up so you can get the latest updates and news. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't throw in a shameless plug for our VIB National Conference. So November 8th and 9th, registration will begin on Monday, May 3rd. So coming up in another week and some change to get signed up for our national conference in November. A lot of great resources. I believe that's where we first met our presenter today, Adam, was at our first national conference 5 years ago. So
Yes, sir.
with that, I believe if you're not logged in at this point, please get your audio and get logged in. I'd also like to take a quick minute to thank our sponsors, T-Mobile, Union Bank, and Merck. They are helping us provide this information and our training series, and so we appreciate their support. They allow us to have this platform such as GoToWebinar, and so we'd like to thank them for their efforts. With that, I would like to move and introduce our presenter today. Adam Austin is the Cybersecurity Lead at Totem.Tech. Adam is part of Totem.Tech. They are a minority and veteran-owned contractor who has prime contracts with the Department of Defense. So Adam, highly qualified. You can see his bio on the screen. He's got the degrees and the certifications to back up what he's going to say today. He can talk the talk and he walks the walk in terms of cybersecurity. Obviously, over the past year, everything has shifted from in-person to going online, and that presents a giant opportunity for bad people to do bad things with information and all of that. And so we're happy to have Adam online today to tell us, what's coming up, what's on the horizon, and what we can expect in terms of what we need to do for our businesses to do work with the Department of Defense. And generally speaking, as the Department of Defense goes, so does the rest of the government eventually. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Adam. Oh, one quick admin note, please. If you do have questions, type them into the chat, and we'll try and address all the questions near the end of the presentation. Adam, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Cole, and thanks to Rebecca and all the fine folks at VIB, at the VIB Network. Yeah, Totem.Tech was part of the first national conference, so I can echo Cole's suggestion that you sign up for the national conference in November. It's a good deal for all veteran-owned businesses, especially those trying to do business with the state and local and federal governments. So we're happy to be back presenting, or I'm happy to be back presenting. Today we're going to talk about the evolving contractor cybersecurity requirements for those of us that are contracting with the Department of Defense. Anywhere in the Department of Defense's supply chain, we have some cybersecurity requirements of some kind. So all the way from the huge, large prime contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, BAE, all the way down to the lawn maintenance folks that mow the grass at the Pentagon, have processed some kind of federal government information, DoD related federal government information that bears some safeguarding, some protection. And pretty soon, so in the next several years, we will all be held accountable for protecting that information through a coming cybersecurity certification process. So we're going to talk about what the requirements are, what our approach is, especially for small businesses that are either already in the DoD contracting supply chain or looking to get into the supply chain. Well, so we'll talk about our methodology and our approach to implementing these cybersecurity requirements. And then we'll touch briefly at the end of the presentation on what the existing assessment and certification requirements are for your contractor-owned IT system, as well as what the coming in the future state of those assessments are. So yeah, thanks, welcome, let's get rocking and rolling. On this slide, we see what I think is a very visceral example of why the DoD is requiring us, privately owned organizations that happen to process unclassified information for the DoD, why it can hold us and why it needs to hold us responsible for protecting some of its information that we process for the DoD. What you see on the bottom here, and many of you have probably already seen or may have seen similar images to this, but the bottom two pictures are so United States and some of our allies, 5th generation, latest generation multi-role aircraft, airborne weapon system, the F-35. And on the top is what we've designated the J-31. It's a Chinese knockoff copycat version of the F-35. It's been in the news, the fact that the Chinese have knocked off and copycatted the F-35. And it looks very similar, as you can tell from these pictures. All indications are that this J-31 performs very similarly as well. And the difference is the Chinese can produce this for an order of magnitude cheaper than we can. So J-31 costs them about $10 million to produce, and F-35 costs us about $100 million. And that's because that's facilitated, that's cheapness, the cost savings is facilitated because the Chinese stole much of the information about the design, research, and engineering development, the operation of the F-35, as well as efficient manufacturing processes for the F-35. They stole that information from the Department of Defense industrial base, what we call the DIB, us, the members of the Department of Defense supply chain. And it stole that information not just from old-fashioned boots on the ground human intelligence and spy work, but maybe even the majority of that theft came through cyber attack and on so small business DoD contractor networks, processing unclassified information. So they could steal information about how a particular valve in the engine was designed and efficiently manufactured. And they steal information about how the cockpit electronic warfare systems work. And in aggregate, little bits of theft from all of us, all 200, maybe 300,000 plus members of the DIB, in aggregate, these little thefts through cyber attacks add up and represent what you see here. So the Department of Defense recognizes its supply chain, the defense industrial base, as a significant source of risk to our military competitive advantage when our adversaries, especially the nation state level adversaries like China, Russia, North Korea, the Iranians, if they can take advantage of the fact that especially the small businesses in the Department of Defense supply chain don't pay as much attention maybe to cybersecurity as we need to be, then that's a risk to the Department of Defense. And so they need to do something about that risk. And to that end, Department of Defense has some clauses, some requirements that they can inject into contracts and require prime contractors to flow down through subcontracts that will require us to implement some cybersecurity safeguards. And pretty soon, the Department of Defense will be able to hold us accountable for proper implementation of those safeguards. So we're going to talk about the history of the safeguard requirements. We'll talk about our approach as a small business and a small business consultant to implementing those safeguards in a small business environment. And then we'll talk at the end about how the Department of Defense is going to be able to hold us accountable for implementing those. All right. Well, I'm going to try to keep it as high level as possible. Cybersecurity is acronym soup. It's an acronym laden environment. All right, so I'll do my best to expand all these acronyms and explain them. We're going to get into a bunch on this very first slide, which I apologize for, but then I don't apologize for. It's busy, but it's also chock full of good information. And VIB Network is going to provide you a downloadable version of this slide deck. All of the linked and underlined text on any of these slides is clickable. So you can drive and delve right into the source of all this information. If you have any questions about any of these acronyms, throw them in the chat. Like Cole said, at the end, we're going to leave a few minutes for question and answer period. All right, so let's take a look at the types of information that we could process for the Department of Defense and our requirements, or the requirements levied upon us to protect that information. I'm going to start up in the top right section of this slide, and we're going to talk about federal contract information, FCI, first. So FCI, almost literally the definition of FCI is all information generated by or for a federal contract that shouldn't or is not made available to the general public. All right, that's a pretty broad definition. It cuts a large swath, and it's literally like that. So any information that you generate for your contract or that you receive as part of that contract from the federal government, and the DoD is part of the federal government, is considered FCI, as long as that information hasn't already been made available to the general public, or common sense says it should not be made available to the general public. So this could be information like drawings and specifications that are associated with the contract that you download from an online portal like DIBS or C folders. Or it could be information like purchase orders or delivery orders or invoices that you receive from or send back to your prime contractor or DoD customer. All right, it's a lot. Again, the definition of FCI is very broad. We have, through a FAR clause, the clause 52-204-21, so the FAR being the Federal Acquisitions Regulation, the contracting Bible for the federal government. There's a clause that's in all federal government contracts that requires some basic safeguarding of FCI. In fact, there are 17 basic safeguards that are called out by this clause, and they run the gamut from requirements like that we have antivirus software installed on workstations and servers in our environment. They require physical protection of our brick and mortar facilities where FCI is handled, require locks on doors and windows, for instance. So 17 basic sort of common sense safeguards, cybersecurity safeguards for this FCI. Now there's a subset of FCI, and then we have this sort of cute little Venn diagram here in the middle. A subset of FCI is CUI, controlled unclassified information. And this is information that's generated by or for a federal government contract that some law or regulation or policy dictates the necessity for some more stringent, more in-depth cybersecurity safeguards that we put in place. And executive branch in 2010 directed, through an executive order, directed NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, to adopt a government-wide, or at least executive branch-wide, policy for the protection of controlled unclassified information. All right, so this the CUI, the subset of FCI. And the Department of Defense, in turn, adopted that policy through their Department of Defense Instruction 5200.48, just in last year, just over a year ago in March. And that gives the Department of Defense the ability to inject some of their, or some additional stringency clauses, namely the DFARS clause. So this is the Department of Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, clause 252-204-7012. I told you there's a lot of acronyms, right? So they have a clause in Department of Defense contracts can direct us to prepare our contractor-owned IT systems to handle securely the CUI. That's this clause. And at a high level, this clause requires us to provide quote unquote adequate security for that CUI, this sort of safeguard that CUI from a logical and physical standpoint. It also requires us to develop an incident response and reporting capability to recognize within our own IT systems when that CUI may have been breached or when our systems may have had an incident. And we have to report those types of incidents to the DoD so that the DoD can investigate and perhaps attribute to our adversaries and maybe even apply some retribution. All right. So as part of adequate security and incident response, that these high-level requirements in turn translates to the requirement in DFARS 7012 that we implement or adopt a set of standards, a cybersecurity safeguard set of standards, and that standard is published by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, special publication 800-171. So some of you may have heard of 800-171. That's this standard that's published by NIST. And in addition to, so we have this arrow coming down from the top right, in addition to those basic safeguards for FCI, 800-171 has 93 additional safeguards for CUI for a total of 110 safeguards that we have to put in place. And this significantly expands the types and level of stringency of protections that we have to put in place at our contractor-owned IT systems. So it dictates, for instance, that we contractors spin up a cybersecurity awareness and training program. It dictates that we conduct risk assessments and vulnerability assessments on our IT systems. To be in compliance with DFARS 7012, right now, we essentially need to have plans in place. We need to have a system security plan, which is like a set of blueprints for a cybersecurity program. We have to have assessed our current state of implementation of our cybersecurity program against the standard 800-171, and there will always be gaps. And we just need a plan to shore up those gaps. And that gap shoring plan is called a plan of action and milestones, a POAM. And then we need an incident response plan that helps support this incident response and reporting capability. So with these three plans, we abide by the DFARS 7012 clause. We'll see in a bit that there's some legwork that we have to undertake before we can get to a place where we can generate these plans. But up until recently, the DoD had no way to hold us accountable for even having these plans in place. That changed last year with the addition of a couple of additional clauses, DFARS 7019 and DFARS 7020. You can think of these as sort of a couple of additional tools in the DoD contracting toolkit that require us to self-assess our implementation of DFARS 7012 and report to the Department of Defense the results of our self-assessment. We'll get into what we call the DoD Assessment Methodology towards the end of the presentation. And then coming soon to a theater near you, in the next several years, a new certification program will be rolled out, and DoD has targeted full rollout of this program by 2026, and this is the CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, where we'll actually, as contractors, be required to hire an external third-party assessment organization to validate our self-assessment results. It'll be similar to the requirement to hire an ISO certifying board to certify us for ISO 9001 or AS 9100. It'll be very similar to those types of processes. All right. For now, if you're a DoD contractor, you're already part of a supply chain, or you're looking to get into the DoD supply chain as a contractor, you don't have to panic right now, but there is work to do. All right. If you have DFARS 7012 in your contract or subcontract or some language that that mimics the DFARS 7012 requirement to implement 800-171 and the cybersecurity safeguards. Right now, compliance means three things, like I mentioned: system security plan, a set of blueprints for your cybersecurity program. If you have the DFARS 7019 clause in your contract, which all new contracts with DFARS 7012 in them will include 7019 and 7020 as well. Then you're required to assess your current level of implementation of your cybersecurity program, generate a score according to a rubric that's provided as part of a methodology, and report that score to the DoD. There will be gaps that come out of that self-assessment process, and so you need a plan of action and milestones to shore those gaps up, a plan to remediate your deficiencies. And then a cyber incident response and reporting capability, which is dictated by an incident response plan. So you can develop plans and self-assess your organization against the expectations that you outlay in those plans and be in compliance with the current DFARS clauses. All right. But even to be able to get to the point where you generate these plans requires some upfront work. I'm going to take you through in the next couple of slides. I'll take you through at a high level, the methodology that we approach being able to build these plans for ourselves and our clients. There's some work to do. When CMMC comes along, you will have to have all deficiencies remediated. You will not be able to have a plan of action and milestones that has not been completed, all right? So you will have to have full implementation of a cybersecurity program. And that's going to take some work, especially for small businesses. So the earlier you can start this process, the better off you will be, and the easier it will be to pass the CMMC assessment when that comes in over the next couple of years. All right, so let's dig into a little bit of our approach, our methodology for getting compliant with the DFARS 7012 clause, as well as preparing for the CMMC assessments, preparing to be held accountable for these requirements for protecting this information. And we have a methodology. It's a three-phase or three-step methodology. I'm going to skip ahead a couple of slides just to show you the third step. It's not until the third step that we get to the point where we're building these plans that I just mentioned. All right, we have some upfront legwork to do, and we can't get to this point, and you certainly don't want to jump to the point of buying a bunch of technology that you're going to use to secure your IT system. All right, we need to understand the footprint of our IT system and develop policies first to control that system before we go start looking at buying and procuring technology to help secure our system. And I'll just put a word of caution here. There is no one piece of technology. There's no one black box that you put in your network that solves all of these cybersecurity problems. And don't let any cybersecurity technology vendors tell you that. If they do, they're selling you snake oil. There's no magic bullet. There's no silver bullet piece of technology that solves all these problems. Because even with the technology that you do have to put in place, things like firewalls and email protection and encryption of the information, even with that technology in place, you still have to secure your humans. You still have to train your humans, right? The users of this information, the handlers of your FCI and CUI. You have to train those folks to use the technology properly and to use their heads when they're dealing with especially controlled unclassified information. By use your head, I mean, don't fall for that phishing email that is enticing you to click on that link that is going to try to install malware on your machine. Or pay attention when you're crafting an email that you're not sending CUI inadvertently to somebody that doesn't need to receive it. There's no technology out there that can help with that. It's a human, and we have to train our humans. So just a little bit of a digression there. I'll come back. Our three-phased approach. The first step you need to take in this cybersecurity compliance journey is to determine the scope of the system that you have to protect. All right. The system being hardware that stores and processes the federal government information, the software and the applications that you execute on that hardware to do so, the people that use that hardware and software, and all the networking equipment like wireless access points, switches, firewalls that facilitate the use of those assets. You have to determine the scope. All right. That's even tricky if you don't understand the life cycle of the federal government information throughout your organization. So the very first steps before we talk about any policy development, plan development, and technology procurement is to understand the information and how it matriculates through your environment, both the FCI and the CUI. So we characterize what we call the life cycle of that information in our environment. And through that characterization process, we will gain an understanding of the scope of what we call the covered system. And the covered system is your IT system that you have to apply these safeguards to. And then we can start doing things like developing a catalog of all the hardware and software in our covered system and the users of that hardware and software. So to facilitate this first step, we have some free tools available for you. And you can download this guide that I'm going to go through just briefly here from our website, from our blog here. So there's a link. But I'm going to take a step back and remind you of the definitions of federal contract information and differentiate CUI, controlled unclassified information, from FCI. FCI is all information generated by or for a federal contract that's not made available to the general public. So if you think about all of that information, delivery orders, purchase orders, invoices, perhaps some contractual artifacts, all of the work products that you develop by virtue of executing your small part in a federal government contract, that's all FCI. So determining the scope of where that FCI resides means all the hardware, all the software, all the people, all the networking devices that support the manipulation, the handling of FCI in your environment. The DFARS 7012 clause and the additional, about 100 additional safeguards that we have to put in place to protect this more sensitive, controlled, unclassified information, determining what that information is a little bit trickier than determining what your federal contract information is, or the plain old federal contract information. Remember, CUI is a subset of FCI. And if DFARS 7012 is in your contract or flowed down to you from a prime contractor, then that is direction for you to prepare to properly safeguard the CUI that you may or may not handle. All right, the 7012 clause is direction to prepare even if you don't have that information yet. But that puts us in sort of a catch-22. It's a chicken and the egg scenario. Like, how are we supposed to prepare, adequately secure our IT system to handle information that we're not sure we even have in our environment? So to help facilitate the identification of that information that may be in your environment already or may be in the future, we have this identification guide, and it's a sort of flowchart decision tree. You start up here. If you only produce commercial off-the-shelf products for a DoD as part of a DoD contract, or you're under the micro purchase threshold of $10,000 annually, then you are exempt from the CUI DFARS 7012 requirements. The information is not considered CUI. But everyone else, and those of you that have DFARS 7012 in a contract or flowed down to you by a subcontract, you need to take a proactive approach to trying to identify the CUI in your environment or potential CUI in your environment. Because the DoD, even though ultimately it's their responsibility to identify this information with us, they lag sorely behind that in that responsibility. So they have put the onus on us through policy, put the onus on us as contractors to begin the identification process in our environment. So I won't belabor this identification guide too much. Suffice it to say, there's a series of decision steps you go through. And each of these boldface words, if you download the guide, are links to references that will help you determine what type of DoD-related controlled unclassified information you might have in your environment. Ultimately, there are 4 categories of that information: controlled technical information, and these are things like engineering drawings of parts that go into military systems; infrastructure security information, so this is information related to DoD facilities, especially those facilities that are used to store explosives or handle explosives. And then there's 2 types of nuclear related information as well. And if you download the guide and drill in here, there's examples given by National Archives and Records Administration for each of these types of information, or each of these categories of information. So it can help you all determine whether or not you have or will have CUI in your environment, and it will help you scope what's going to be your covered system, and hopefully help you shrink the scope of your covered system so that you don't have as much to secure in your environment. Now, lifecycle determination. Once you understand the information that you have in your environment, you want to gain an understanding of and characterize how it's received or generated, who is responsible for identifying it and marking it. So those of you that have operated in a classified environment with like secret and top secret markings on documents, you'll have an unclassified marking for controlled unclassified information that's called CUI. So we're responsible for marking it as well. How do you store it? Internally, do you use external cloud backup systems? How is it accessed locally? Who has access to this information? Do you have to send it anywhere externally, either to your suppliers or vendors or back to your customer? And then how do you dispose of the information once its life cycle is complete in your environment? Do you use a shredding service? Do you outsource printer maintenance, for instance? So once you know the information and you characterize that information's life cycle in your environment, any asset, any component, hardware, software, network, or users that facilitate any of these life cycle phases of this information are in scope. They're covered, and you have to apply the protections to all of those assets. So undertaking that lifecycle determination facilitates description and documentation of the system, where you would capture interconnections, like do you allow connections to the Microsoft Office cloud? It's an interconnection. You'll characterize those interconnections. Develop system diagrams. Generate lists of contacts in your organization that have security responsibilities. Make sure that you separate duties in your environment as much as possible. It's tricky in a small business environment, but make sure that no one individual holds all of the keys to your kingdom, at least from a security perspective. And then we can start generating our plans to secure all of the information and secure the system. So once we've wrapped our head around the information and wrapped our head around the system that handles that information, we can start generating the plans to secure that system and the information that the system handles. And by handles, I mean the system processes processes the information, stores it, and transmits it. Once we have our head wrapped around all that, we can start building our plans. And so our methodology, we actually have a piece of software that we use. It's a cloud-based cybersecurity planning software. So when you see this totem with the little trademark here, that's what we're talking about. It's a cybersecurity planning tool. And in our methodology, we use that tool to simultaneously assess the current state of implementation, develop the system security plan, which, like I said, it's a set of blueprints. So it establishes the expected future state of your cybersecurity program. The SSP provides details about how you will go about implementing the over 100 different safeguards in your environment. The results of the security assessment surely will turn up some deficiencies, some gaps. It's natural. We just have to have a plan to shore those gaps up. So if I make an analogy here, if the SSP is your set of blueprints for your cybersecurity program, you can think of those analogously. You can think of blueprints like a set of architectural drawings for a house. You're going to build a new home. Well, you have the architectural drawings. How do you turn those drawings into your new home? You need a set of work instructions, or you need building contractors, framers, electricians, plumbers. You need those folks to understand a methodology for how to turn architectural diagrams into a tangible home that you can live in. Work instructions, best practices. That's something you can think of analogously to a plan of action and milestones. You have a set of blueprints, you translate those into work instructions in something called a plan of action and milestones. How do we get from here to there? And then IRP, incident response plan. We have templates for incident response plans available as well if you don't have one, but you need to have one to be fully compliant with the DFARS 7012 clause. So you need a plan for how to identify anomalous behavior in your IT environment and what sort of steps you will take to address that anomalous behavior. And if the anomalous behavior indicates a compromise of your system, that's what we call an incident, and you actually have to report those incidents to the DoD so that the DoD can help you figuratively fight that fire if need be. All right, so we have to report the incidents to the DoD. Okay, that's our three-phased methodology. I know I went very quickly through that. There's even more acronyms in these slides, but if you take away anything from this presentation, know that there are a couple of different types of information that we would have to worry about securing: FCI and its subset CUI, and that we can't start securing any of that information until we understand that information's life cycle in our environment. Don't put the cart before the horse. Don't go purchasing technology and hiring folks to secure your system until you fully, truly intimately understand the system that you need to secure. Otherwise, putting the cart before the horse, otherwise you're going to spend way more money than you need to spend to secure your information system. And you're going to end up potentially in a situation where you have to back out protections, or you didn't engineer your IT system with the necessary protections in place, and you have to change those security protections later in the future. It can be very painful. So we've found this three-phase methodology to work for ourselves as a U.S. Air Force prime contractor handling controlled unclassified information, as well as a nice approachable methodology, especially for our clients that are entering this compliance journey knowing nothing about cybersecurity. We're breaking it off into manageable bite-sized chunks through a methodology like this. Now, ultimately, we're going to be held accountable for implementing the controls. And we said that up until recently, the Department of Defense did not have any mechanisms to hold us accountable, but as of the end of last year, they do. They have something called the Department of Defense 800-171 Assessment Methodology. And if DFARS 252-204-7019 or 7020 are in your contract, and as I mentioned, they will be coupled with DFARS 7012 in contracts going forward, then at a minimum, you're required to self-assess your implementation of the safeguards. And the DoD has published a methodology with a scoring rubric that guides you through your self-assessment. There are 110 safeguards that we have to put in place. Under this methodology, under the scoring rubric, you can actually end up with a negative score. And you have to have your SSP, you have to have your cybersecurity program blueprints before you can even undertake the self-assessment and generate a score. But right now, all the DoD wants from us is for us to report that score. And all members of the supply chain with DFARS 7012 and 7019 and 20 in their contract have to report this score directly to the DoD. It's not like you report it to a prime contractor unless the prime contractor asks for it. So you need access to a reporting portal called the Supplier Performance Risk System, SPRS. We have a blog on how to get access to that system and generate your score. But the DoD just wants to wrap its head around the overall level of risk of its supply chain, of its industrial base. And so it wants us at a minimum to self-assess and report the score. That self-assessment and reporting constitutes a basic level of assurance or confidence for the DoD. They do have a wing of the Defense Contractor Management Agency, DCMA. The wing is called DIBCAC, the DIB Cybersecurity Assessment Center. And they are tasked with conducting higher level, more fully assured assessments or audits, validations of our scores. So DIBCAC is currently conducting these audits. They can manage a few hundred a year at most. It's nowhere near the volume that's required for the DoD to gain a reasonable level of assurance that the tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of us that process that controlled unclassified information are doing our job. So although this is a good first step to holding us accountable, this is merely a stopgap. In the future, we will all be held accountable, all of us, all members of the supply chain, whether or not we process CUI or not, will be held accountable by having to hire a third-party assessment organization to assess us against target levels. So all contractors, we all process FCI of some kind. We're going to be at least have to target a CMMC level 1, where we'll have an assessor, independent objective assessor, assess our implementation of those 17 basic practices. And then those of us that process CUI, that subset of FCI, will have to target at least a level 3 CMMC assessment, where we're going to be, we'll have to show that we've fully implemented 800-171 plus a few additional controls called out specifically by this new CMMC model. Level 4 and level 5 are going to be reserved for a select few, your prime contractors, your subcontractors that work on high value, high risk programs like missile defense, nuclear arsenal upgrade, those sorts of things. And there are a significant increase in the number of safeguards that those organizations will have to implement. So as you go up from level 1 to level 5, an increase in the safeguards that you have to implement and an increase in the stringency of assessment that the DoD will require us to undergo. A little bit of timeline for the CMMC before I jump into the maturity levels, and then I'll wrap up. This is a phased, CMMC is being phased into only new contracts over the course of 5 or 6 years. The earliest that they can start phasing it into general contracts will be next fiscal year 22. most of you all on this call won't see the CMMC requirements in a contract or subcontract for a year or more, all right? So it's nothing to panic about right now, but there is a lot of work, as we mentioned. You need to get started as soon as possible. In addition to showing that you've implemented safeguards with CMMC, you're also going to have to demonstrate quote unquote maturity. You're going to have to, in other words, there's a lot of information on this slide. I'm not going to read all this verbatim, but in a nutshell, maturity means as an organization, you're going to have to institutionalize cybersecurity. You're going to have to create a cybersecurity culture. Many of you are in manufacturing or construction, I imagine. You have a safety culture in your environment. Otherwise, you'll go out of business from OSHA violations, workman's comp, claims, lawsuits maybe. You have to have a safety culture to operate. Plus, you care about your workers, right? It will be the same for cybersecurity. You're going to have to care about this Department of Defense information. You're going to have to inculcate or institutionalize a cybersecurity culture in your organization to pass a CMMC maturity assessment, especially at level 3 for CUI, which is called managed security. All right, so that's something else to think about. It's not a one and done process. You're going to have to show institutionalized cybersecurity culture over a period of time, just like with the safety culture. A lot of information in a nutshell. I know, in what are we at, 45 minutes. We offer a free ebook on this subject. If you just email us at info@Totem.Tech with the subject line free ebook. It's a PDF ebook that goes into much more detail on all these topics that I covered and more, and it elaborates on our methodology a little bit, okay? Here's my contact information, as well as our business contact information. Feel free to reach out anytime, preferably through email. If you have any questions, I'm happy to talk about any of these topics. We also offer monthly workshops where we take you through our methodology, and we use that piece of software that I mentioned in that workshop to help build plans. That's my time. I want to thank you for your all's time, and thank you again to the VIB Network. Really appreciate, again, the opportunity to present this. I know the cybersecurity stuff can be scary for a lot of you. There is an approach that makes it manageable for the small business, and we'd be happy to talk more about that. So thanks, and Cole, I'll turn it back to you and see if there are questions. I'm happy to stick around for questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it. We do have one question here. So if a business sells COTS, commercial off-the-shelf items, and they do not have 7012 in their contract, then do they need to achieve that level 3 or above? And what is in the COTS scope? So I know you touched on that in your flow chart. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, let me go back to that chart. Yeah, so if you're selling COTS, and what's COTS? COTS is commercial off-the-shelf. It is a product that is sold in quote-unquote significant quantities on the commercial marketplace, and the version of that product that's sold to the DoD is not modified in any significant way from that commercial product. If you sell COTS products to the Department of Defense, that information about those products is not CUI. It is exempt from this process. So if you sell COTS and you don't have 7012, you are not targeting any CMMC level. Unless, there's a caveat, right? Federal contract information is all information about a contract that's not releasable to the general public. So if you're not selling your COTS products through some, like the Air Force AFWay portal, which is you can get to from as the general public, then you may have some FCI that's related to the contract itself. And if you process FCI, you're going to target CMMC level 1. But you're not going to be targeting level 3 or above for sure. Great question.
And William, if you have more on that, please put that in the questions. So when I hear cybersecurity, I kind of tune out. I am a general contractor. You used a metaphor that speaks to me when you're talking about a set of plans, right, to build a house.
Yeah.
So looking at this flow chart, and I have contracts with the Navy, National Guard, things along those lines. It sounds to me like there's a possibility in the near future that I could have a solicitation come across my desk that is to build a new building on a Navy base, for example. And it sounds like that feasibly could meet your critical infrastructure security information. Let's say it's a brand new facility that will itself house classified information and therefore could possibly meet this requirement. Is that so far? Am I tracking along the right train of thought?
You're 100%, Cole. I would think it would definitely fit into this category. On a Navy base, we have several clients, in fact, in the Pacific Northwest that just by virtue of working on the Navy base, the Navy are constructing any building, even if it's an outhouse on the Navy base. They have tagged that information as unclassified controlled nuclear information, so UCNI, and all of the plats are marked UCNI, so it's controlled unclassified information. All of the facilities diagrams, all of the what do they call it, riser diagrams, like the internal guts of like an electrical system in a building. Those are all marked UCNI, controlled unclassified information. So yes, if I think you could very likely see that information or this clause in the future, Cole.
So let me continue to pull that thread a bit. So I get these plans from the Navy, right? And let's say it is for an outhouse. And so, you know, in my mind, not necessarily secret documents, but controlled. I've seen where they will send those files to me through one of their secure websites. I believe one I've used recently is like the DoD Safe, I believe they call it.
DoD Safe, yep.
So they send me a link to that. Now again, I'm a general contractor. When you say IT system, I'm like, do you mean my email through GoDaddy or do you mean my cloud service Dropbox? That is my quote unquote, that's my IT system. So I download it from DoD Safe through their system and then I drop it into the Dropbox. So
all of the above. All of the above, right?
Okay.
So it's, and then you're using a laptop or a tablet or maybe even your phone to access that information. That's in scope as well. Yep.
Okay. And now I pull that a little bit further. Now let's say instead of an outhouse, let's say it is a legitimate, we'll call it like a 10,000 square foot facility, offices, restrooms, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So I'm going to have about 20 or 30 subcontractors, right? I've got the carpet guy, I've got the plumber, the electrician, et cetera, et cetera. Now I need to distribute these drawings and specifications for the building to those subcontractors. Now, it sounds to me like those clauses that dictate all of this are going to automatically be required of me to flow down to them. Am I still on the right path?
You are 100% correct.
Okay. And so
lots of ramifications.
Now,
yep.
Yeah. And so now so up to that point, it sounds like I'm required to make sure they are meeting these requirements. But let's go one step further when you start talking about accountability and responsibility in the future for potential breaches and things like that, and ways that the government can then come and hold us accountable. That to me, whenever somebody starts talking about, a breach or accountability for such a thing or liability, now we're talking insurance requirements, right? Like, so in the near term, it sounds like I'm going to be required to have some sort of cybersecurity liability insurance and things like that. Is that kind of what you're seeing in the industry as well, or?
Yeah, the requirements for cybersecurity insurance are not part of the DFARS clauses, the 7012 clause, 7019, 7020, but we have seen contracts that require some sort of liability insurance associated with them. Not terribly frequently on the government contracting side, but more and more frequently on the business to business side. So But like you said, Cole, the DoD is the tip of the spear for federal government contracting. So whatever the DoD adopts, the rest of the branches or the rest of the executive branch agencies will adopt eventually. So if I personally have not seen the requirement in a DoD contract for cybersecurity insurance, it can be a good idea. And I say can be because you really have to pay attention to what's in your insurance policy and if they're really going to cover your back for any breach. But it is in general, good policies are a good idea. I just have not seen them as firm and fast requirements in contracts myself.
Okay. All right. Switching back, so that was kind of my dummies approach to this whole process. I want to address, we've had a few more questions come up. One of them, any real world examples of the effective cost to augment a typical general contractor's practices to implement these new requirements? I'm sure when you're talking about costs, a lot of it depends on current infrastructure, you know, what programs you use, your own servers, etc. But in terms of that, what I hate to put you on the spot in terms of cost, like, oh, how much does Totem charge? But you know, any idea on what we should anticipate, especially for those of us who aren't in that space? I mean, I feel like a lot of contractors are out there, and I hate to focus only on contractors, but you know, what are you seeing in terms of cost and implementation and augmentation for these type of things?
Yeah, so it's a great question and one that we get all the time, and it's not really putting me on the spot. I'm limited in my scope of the view of the problem, and that is my limitation is our company ourselves. So Bay and Associates, our prime contracting entity. So what I can talk about is the costs that we've had to outlay. I'm also hesitant to talk because I don't want to scare, especially potential DoD contractors, away from this. But you have to understand there is always a cost of doing business with the federal government, and the cybersecurity stuff is going to be significant additional cost. For us, we're a micro business. We are 11 employees and growing. We're hiring 2 new folks this week. We have our ongoing monitoring costs. So we outsource a portion of our cybersecurity capabilities. Those ongoing monitoring costs are between $25,000 and $50,000 annually. Our ongoing day-to-day managed service for our IT system. So everybody has a workstation. We have a couple of cloud services, and we have a couple of on-premise servers. It's not a big footprint. That's over $40,000 annually. So right there, you're talking about between $60,000 and $90,000 annually. In reoccurring or non-reoccurring engineering to get to this point, we've spent over $50,000. So we had a legacy IT system that we built when we won the Air Force contract. We had to re-architect part of that to meet these requirements when they first came out in 2016. So we're over $100,000 in the first year cost, and then pushing $100,000 for ongoing recurring costs. That doesn't factor in the cost of the CMMC Level 3 assessment, which the DoD itself has estimated, and this number is insane to me, so take this with a grain of salt. The DoD has estimated itself that it will cost a small business $60,000 annually to maintain a Level 3 assessment. I don't see how that is sustainable and feasible. I see it kicking hundreds of thousands, at least tens of thousands of small businesses out of the DoD contracting environment, which is a terrible shame. And I think our Congress people will rise up in arms against that if that is a true number. But that's the number that's been foisted by the DoD. So I'm just trying to give you realistic numbers. It's not hundreds, it's not thousands, it's tens of thousands, even for your smallest businesses annually, to manage this.
I think you just scared a lot of us, and I say us, myself included.
I know. I apologize. All I can do is tell you the facts. The DoD will tell you the cost of doing business with the DoD, right?
Yeah, and that's why a toilet costs $20,000, right? The old joke.
Yeah, isn't it funny? It's kind of a.
Can you hop over? Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go for it. We're almost at the top of the hour anyway.
Can you go back to your slide with the email for the ebook? I think you're going to have a lot more downloads after, when you start putting dollars and cents to what all this costs.
Yeah.
Got another question here. Is the goal to have all federal government contractors, or at least in your mind, the goal long term, all federal government contractors with at least CMMC level 1, regardless of commercial or other dollar thresholds? And if so, by when?
Great question. So the goal for the DoD contractors is to have all of DoD contractors at least level 1 by 2026. That date slides further and further to the right every day because the Department of Defense is already a year behind in its plan for that target number of target date of 2026. So all DoD contractors anywhere in the supply chain, prime contractor down to the lawn maintenance crews of the Pentagon, they will all have to have at least a CMMC level 1 by 2026. And there was another part to that question, Cole, that I forgot. Oh, dollars and cents aside. Yes, dollars and cents aside. Yeah. So 2026. The DoD is phasing in an approach. So 15 prime contracts this fiscal year, supposedly, although that looks like it's slipping to the right. 75 prime contracts and all of its associated supply chain next fiscal year, and then it just increases from there. So they're starting with these contracts that are led by primes, obviously, and the initial CMMC rollout will affect all of the supply chain for that given prime contractor's contract.
Perfect. We are over our hour. I still have one or two more questions here. Are you all right to stay online? We appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you, Adam. We want to jump back to the COTS question. So if somebody sells commercial off the shelf, but they transmit info, will they need the CMMC?
What type of information is my question back to that, right? It depends. So if you transmit federal contract information, you'll need at least CMMC level 1. Yes. And that federal contract information, the rule of thumb definition is it's all information about by or for a federal contract that's not made available to the general public. So any documents that you see marked for official use only, FOUO, federal contract information. Your delivery orders from your prime contractor, purchase orders, those sorts of things, your invoices back to that prime contractor, if it contains part numbers, those sorts of things, or bills of lading, where the parts are going, potentially, there's a good chance that stuff is FCI because you're not making that information available to the general public. You're not publishing it on your website. You're not publishing it on social media, right? So that's your rule of thumb to go by. And my question is always, or my answer to those types of questions is always, well, it depends. Use that rule of thumb. Would you make that information available to the general public? If not, the DoD is probably going to categorize it as federal contract information.
Great. And again, use the flow chart to the best of your ability, but also when in doubt, probably assume the worst case scenario that it does fall under that and meets the more stringent requirements, right?
I don't like saying that because we should not be over classifying and over categorizing information, but it seems to be that is the Department of Defense's default, is assume the worst case.
Okay. Someone has talked about, Pamela, a question about SBIR contracts. Are you familiar with SBIR contracts, Adam?
Absolutely. We have two companies with an SBIR contract in our workshop this month, in fact.
So can you talk about, what is required for those type of contracts, especially moving from phases 1 to phase 2 when you're in an SBIR contract? For those of you that don't know what an SBIR contract, Adam, if you could touch on a little bit of that too. I hate to put you on the spot, but my knowledge, I can't even remember what the acronym is, and I was just talking about this 2 days ago.
Yeah, there's so many acronyms. I don't even know how I keep them all straight. It's Small Business Innovative Research or Small Business Innovation and Research, something like that. Usually sort of seed contracts for businesses that have some kind of innovation in a technology with a product or a service, mostly products. And you can get an initial grant, I think, of up to 100,000 or $1 million, something like that in phase 1. And then in phase 2, you get X number of millions to continue the research and development of your proposed product that solves some DoD need. And that's a great question, because those folks in our workshop won the phase 1 CIBR grant, and the grantor, whoever it was, Air Force, Navy, whoever, indicated to them that as part of moving to phase 2, they had to implement DFARS 7012. And they were like, what? And so they come to us and they participate in our workshop, and I explain in much more detail everything that we explained in this presentation, and equip them with tools like this identification guide that you're looking at now to help them figure out if that information that's related to that CIBR product, CIBR funded product, is controlled unclassified information. Most likely it is, because it would be considered controlled technical information, which is a pretty broad category. But again, we teach, instead of handing our participants a fish, we teach you all how to fish. We give you the fishing rod, and this identification guide is one of the fishing rods we give you.
Yeah, so I hope, Pamela, that answers your question. I mean, again, a lot of this has to come down to the very, very particulars of each individual situation. It sounds even, and I turn to construction because it's what I know, but it sounds like there's going to be projects where I don't have CUI, even on a DoD project, and then there's going to be other projects where I do. And I assume those particular projects and all their associated documents, et cetera, will have their own scope and their own life cycle, et cetera, and require their own requirements.
Right. Cole, I would advise, I guess. So we have the client in the Pacific Northwest. They're building something at a naval base, and one of the parts of the project was relaying some asphalt in a parking lot. And so they had to send the plat of the parking lot down to their asphalt striping subcontractor, right? And so my advice to this person in our workshop was, if you can, push back, or at least open up a channel of communication with the Navy to say, does the plat of this parking lot really need to be marked controlled nuclear information? All we need to do is send this to the subcontractor to get some yellow stripes in the parking lot, right? And like, from a common sense perspective, even if the Chinese got hold of that plat, does it really give them any advantage, right? So the question is, do we really need to flow this clause down, this requirements protection clause, down to this asphalt striping subcontractor? Common sense says no. If you just open up that channel of communication with your prime or the DoD branch itself, hopefully common sense will prevail. We are in the process ourselves with the Air Force with some of those common sense type conversations. Like, some of the stuff is, when we're talking about explosives like magazines and aircraft hangars and those sorts of things, it would make sense that it might be critical infrastructure security information. But plats of a parking lot, not so much. So the more we open up these channels of communication, and that's a euphemism for pushback, the less over categorization that will happen, and all of our lives collectively become easier. We have to educate our customer, all right? Because right now they're just blanket, and often many cases, they're just blanket pasting DFARS 7012 into contracts that it should not be in. And if you need help crafting language on how to push back, I'm happy to help craft that language.
Yeah, and I think that falls under train your client, right? You gotta, exactly. The DoD is learning, the contracting officers are learning, and so if we can help them learn the way that is common sense, as opposed, we don't want to put, the DoD at risk, but we also don't want to overprotect ourselves at the point of, being small businesses where you're right. If it's a yellow striping in a parking lot, is it really meet the requirements or the intent? I'm going to ask one question now. If anybody has a final question, that will be it. So whoever comes first. But so speaking along those lines, does it make sense to try and build an IT system across your entire business that tries to meet these requirements? Or would you suggest to a small business owner to try and silo or kind of put all of this into its own enclave where, you know, you've got this section over here that handles your CUI and all these requirements, and then everything else just business as usual? What do you recommend, or what are you seeing small businesses utilize?
Yeah, the latter, 100%. If you're actually in an enviable position, if you can carve off that silo, what we call an enclave, an isolated enclave, maybe even one machine, you only dedicate one workstation to processing this CUI information. If you can do that, by all means do that, because it will shrink your footprint, shrink your scope, shrink your resource allocation, blah, 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 right? You spend less. There's less chance of the adversary breaking into one machine as opposed to a larger footprint, all that. It's goodness all around. The other approach is, like you said, like blanket safeguard all of your information on all of your systems. There's other information that you all process that's equally valuable to the CUI, like your financial information, your tax records, your human resources information, especially your employees' health information. Your intellectual property, the stuff that makes you unique, the stuff that gives your organization a value proposition. That's all equally worthy of protection. So if you do choose the other route to apply these protections to your entire organization, you're helping to secure all of that other valuable information. So there's pros and cons. From a cost allocation pro standpoint, a siloed enclave little mini IT system is an enviable position to be in if you can carve that off.
All right. Our final question has to do with the life cycle. So you talked about the life cycle in terms of the scope and what all the information is. What happens at the end of the life cycle? Like, let's say, you know, again, I'm going to use construction. The building is built, the keys are handed over to the government, and we walk away, but we still have this information. What is the process of control? And I'm sure there's some in-depth answers here, but what if we're done with the project? How do we still have to control it? How does it end? What is the end life?
Yeah, great question. So the first answer to that is, do you have retention requirements in the contract or subcontract? If so, you have to abide those. You need to store the information on a DVD or a hard drive somewhere and go lock it up for however long you have to retain it, 7 years, whatever. If you don't have those retention requirements and you're done with the project, you have to dispose of it in accordance with a NIST standard. That NIST standard is 800-88, and you can download this, it's free, and it describes the disposal instructions, what they call sanitization instructions for all types of media, paper products, USB sticks, hard drives in your laptop. The bottom line, and you guys are not going to like this answer, even for federal contract information, disposal or sanitization of media requires destruction. So this is something to factor in when into your business plan. And especially if you allow your users to like access their email on their personal cell phone, and there's federal contract information in that email, you essentially own their cell phone because you have to destroy the little SD card in that cell phone once the project's done. And more, like your iPhones don't have removable SD cards. It's all in the iPhone. There are huge ramifications for the sanitization. You set me up, Cole, with being the bad guy right at the end of the presentation. Nobody likes that answer, but that is one of the ramifications of this sanitization requirement, even for the lowliest federal contract information out there. I trust me, I'm a nice guy.
No, well, at the end of the day, I think it's better to know and plan for that, cost up front, as opposed to getting caught off guard with it after the contract is coming to an end, and then suddenly you're like, wait, I got to destroy 20 phones? I just bought new ones.
Yeah.
or something to that effect. So, I mean, it's better to know. I would like to thank Adam. Adam, if you could jump to our last slide in the deck, please. Want to thank you for your time. This is definitely a topic that I think a lot of people tend to want to ignore until it gets to a point of being a pain point. You know, so definitely something also that seems like it would be better to implement, start now, go a very methodical, you know, thinking of things such as price and overhead approach, as opposed to trying to chase a contract and then realizing that, you know, like you mentioned, your person on the SBIR contract moving to phase 2, where suddenly it's a gotcha sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so definitely want to thank you for the information. I'll give you the last words before I close out our presentation here.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Cole and Rebecca, the opportunity to present again. The last word is there's a lot of scariness involved with this stuff, like a lot of acronyms, and we're talking about insane costs. But there is a methodology. There's an approach through the darkness to the madness. We can help guide you to that. Just think positive, and you can get through it. The DoD and the federal government, our country needs small businesses. So no matter how scary it looks right now, they will have to make this approachable and affordable for small business in the future, because we are the innovators and we're what makes this country special. So as the DoD works through these kinks, if we can just sort of ride the rapids for now and get through to the other side, the cybersecurity requirements are a good thing that will help bolster and help us protect our intellectual property. And there are lots of resources out there like Totem to help you all through it. So we're here. Don't be too scared.
And I would like to throw a plug for Totem.Tech. Like I said, they did our first webinar like 5 years ago. We met them at the conference. Great company, veteran-owned business. If you are looking to try and, you know, this isn't an advertisement, but solid people over there. Adam, we really appreciate your time. I knew that I had just talked about an SBIR contract. So plug for our next webinar 1 week from today, April 29th at 10 a.m. Pacific. We will be talking about innovative veteran businesses, learn how to work with the Navy through the SBIR, STTR programs. Register for the webinar on our events calendar. A recording of this presentation will be sent out. We'll host it on our website. I believe it'll also be posted on our YouTube channel. I'd like to one more time thank our sponsors. We appreciate them allowing us to provide this information at free of charge to the veteran business community. Adam, thanks again for your time. We appreciate it. I highly encourage all of our attendees to reach out to Adam and Totem if you have questions on how to secure your cybersecurity and IT program. So Adam, thank you again. Thanks to our attendees, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon.